So Nick is one of the founders of the Nomad Podcast, and that's out of the UK, obviously. And maybe tell us a little bit about that, about the Nomad Podcast, Nick, and then maybe kind of tell us a little bit about your the faith expression you grew up in, and kind of how that's evolved over the years.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, it's really, thank you so much. It's great to be with you. It's 12:30. What time is it? 12:35 a.m. and I'm beginning to feel a little bit more awake, having had a few hours sleep. So hopefully I will make sense. And then just, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you. It's really exciting for me too. So Nomad is a podcast that's been going for a long time now. It originally started because I am a football fan, or a soccer fan, and my soccer team got promoted to the Premier League in 2008, and I decided to start a podcast about them. And because I was an evangelical Christian at the time, I felt a bit guilty about doing something quite so frivolous, and so thought that I probably should do a Christian podcast as well. And so I chatted to Tim about whether we would do a podcast, and he wasn't very interested. But then he went away for the weekend and visited a friend, and at his friend's church, someone during the service had a word of knowledge. That it's a very bizarre beginning. Had a word of knowledge that God would use him and his ministry in a new way, and he would communicate to many people. And I think they might have mentioned the internet or something like that. So Tim came back and said, "Oh yeah, we should do a podcast because I had this word of knowledge." So we started a podcast back in those days to document our exploration of fresh expressions of church and missional communities, and what it might mean to live together. We'd recently read Shane Claiborne's The Irresistible Revolution, and we moved, my then wife and I moved onto the same street with Tim and Hannah, and there was another guy involved as well back in those days. And we tried to share our faith in different ways with our neighbours, and we started to interview people, thinkers and writers, about like mission and community and the future of the church. That was the strap line. And we did that for a couple of years, and then circumstances changed, and we left that sort of missional community. And Tim continued and carried on with the podcast. And then through his evolving faith journey, Nomad very gradually became something quite different, I guess largely to reflect his faith experience. And it's gradually evolved over the years into something that, depending on who you chat to, will probably depend on their definition of what Nomad is all about. But I guess it's become a home and a very helpful place for a lot of people who are going through a faith deconstruction journey. And so we interview people, speakers and writers, and talk to them about their faith. We explore different ideas. I guess it's very deliberately trying not to be too much like too pigeonholed in terms of what it is, and too prescriptive, because it often, the interviews and the episodes reflects the different hosts and their, what they're thinking about and what they're reading. And we share as honestly as we can about those interviews, and where we are, and reflect on it. And I suppose the one thing that Tim always encourages us to do as hosts is just to be honest about what we think, and not to try and we're very aware that we're not experts or theologians or thinkers. We're just coming with our own experiences, and we share honestly about our own reflections, just to help people begin to think a little bit about some of the things that we're discussing. So that's Nomad, and I'm involved in one of the spin-off episodes as well, which is really interesting, and I find really helpful personally in my own kind of spiritual journey, which is called Nomad Revisited, where we go back to the beginning and we listen afresh to the interviews, which is quite interesting, obviously, because as I say, the beginning of the podcast is very different than where it is now. So we listen to those interviews, Tim and I, and we talk about how we reflect on those topics now and what we think about. And I guess it's just a really helpful way for us of processing elements of our journey and our evolving faith. So yeah, it's
Cool.
It's great to be part of.
Cool. So I know, Nick, you had mentioned, we were kind of chatting online before via email, kind of about how we wanted to do things tonight. And you had mentioned you're okay if people have questions while you're, chatting. And so if anybody has, a question or anything you wanted to, talk about, feel free to just kind of raise your hand or whatever. But there will also be a question and answer time towards the end as well. So, yeah, Nick, tell us a little bit. I know you guys always kind of open up on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about your image of God that you inherited. Maybe talk a little bit about your, childhood and kind of what, how you, the faith that you inherited and what happened and how that's evolved over the years.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, very happy for to be interrupted and ask questions as we go along. There's this quote which I really like, which I don't know if you've come across this quote by David Augsburger, which says, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person they are almost indistinguishable. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person they're almost indistinguishable. And as I said when I was talking about nomads, I'm no theologian or expert or writer or anything like that. I just come with my experience. But in my journey of my evolving faith, when people have shared their experience or have put words to my own experience, that's such a powerful thing, because I guess that when you're on a journey of kind of moving from one expression of faith to another, it can often feel very disconcerting, and we can often feel kind of disconnected. And so when someone puts words to your experience or shares something that really resonates with you, then it can be really powerful. And I guess it comes into that idea of connection, of being heard. And so all I offer tonight is a very honest account of my own experience, my own journey. And in doing so, I hope that, I'm sure that it will connect with one another. And I look forward to hearing from you and some of your questions. And the other thing I was going to say, just kind of in introduction to this, is that I do and we do on Nomad strive to be honest. And one of the things we often comment on and reflect on is the fact that a lot of people get in touch and say very positive things about the podcast. And one thing that they always say is, thank you for being so honest. And we kind of often reflect on that and kind of think about how unusual or sort of strange a comment that is, because you would sort of think that it's in Christian circles that would be a given, like that people would be honest, but maybe it just comes down to the kind of extent to which we're willing to share our story. So all I bring tonight is my own experience, my own journey, and a commitment to be honest with you. I guess if I'm talking about the way that my faith has evolved and the way that I saw God in my childhood and growing up and for much of my life, in contrast to where I am now, there's a conversation that I had about 5 years ago that sort of is a good way into thinking about that. I was having coffee with someone in Nottingham, which is where I live in the East Midlands of England. And this lady was someone who, in my teens, I kind of hero worshipped a little bit. So she was very charismatic. She was prophetic. She was the leader of an international charismatic women's movement for a time. And she was the kind of person whose every word I used to hang on. And I hadn't seen her for quite a long time. She was like a family friend, and I'd seen her sort of regularly in my teens and early adulthood. And then for a long time, I hadn't seen her. And we were meeting up, so like for the first time, and I'd gone through a really difficult time in my life. My marriage had broken down because of addictive behavior that I had, and that had ruined the trust in our marriage. And I was devastated. It was easily the worst thing that had and has ever happened to me in my life. And I was having to face up to this addictive behavior that had to do with sex. And I was in therapy. I was coming to the end of probably 18 months of therapy by the time that I met her. And as part of that, I'd started running as well. And in the therapy that I was having, one of the mantras was that you can't kick an addiction without changing your life. And running was like the life change, really, that I discovered. And these two things combined had led to what seemed at that time to be a very robust and very genuine recovery. And it was the kind of which I'd never experienced before. I'd gone for periods of time without acting out, but this seemed very different. And now, obviously, in hindsight, it was the start of my recovery. So I met up with this lady, and we were having coffee, and she was very sympathetic about what I'd gone through. And then she started to do what I guess at the time I would have described as kind of speak over me, like speak a prophecy over me in a way. And she said, Nick, what you're going through, you might think disqualifies you from ministry. Because prior to this all happening, I was like, I preached regularly in the church that I attended, and I led small groups and did all this different kind of stuff. And she said, everything that you've gone through with your marriage breakdown and your addiction, you might think that it disqualifies you from ministry, but actually God is dealing with your character. And if you allow him to do this work, he will use you in more powerful ways than you've ever been used before. And if you think about it like a house, it's like you've been operating on the third floor of the house. But when God has finished this work with you of dealing with your character, you're going to be operating on the sixth floor. You're going to be like operating at a much higher level. And I remember sitting there and thinking, like over that period of time since my marriage breakdown, I wasn't quite sure where I was at in my faith. In fact, I probably would have said I was nowhere. I was confused. I was disorientated. I'd tried going to church again, but it wasn't quite working for me. I wasn't quite sure what I made of everything that I'd inherited. But there was something about her words that were quite compelling and quite attractive. And I remember sitting there thinking, is this one of those like life-changing conversations? Wonder if this will change everything. But then she said a sentence that in hindsight, I think it took a long time for it to kind of the significance of it to hit home. But in hindsight, I'd say it was a real turning point for me in my faith journey. So she finished this kind of, prophetic, God can use you in really powerful ways in the future. And then she said, but the thing is, this running and this therapy, that's fine. But kid, you've got to find a church. And I just remember thinking, well, like this running and this therapy, it's changed my life. It's changed me. It's set me free from addiction that I never thought I'd be free of. It's brought me hope and healing and wholeness. It's worked. Like it's taught me things about myself that I never knew. It's helped me to start processing things that I'd never processed. And for someone to say, this running and this therapy, that's okay, but you've got to find a church. It was so jarring. And it sort of resonated with other experiences I had at that time, because for a couple of years, because of the nature of my addiction, I became the go-to person for any of my friends' or friends of friends or friends of friends and friends who were struggling with like a porn addiction or some kind of addiction in that area. And so people would come and see me, or friends would send their friends to see me. And I'd have these conversations where basically I'd just share my experience of recovery, and I'd tell them about the tools that had helped me to stop acting out, and the work that I'd done in therapy to kind of get to the root cause of some of the issues that had led me into addictive behavior. And I'd share this with them. And what I found was that if they were like evangelical Christians, we'd kind of have that sort of conversation, and then they'd say, oh, is it true that you don't go to church anymore? And I'd say, yeah, at the moment I'm not going to church, that's right. And they would say, oh, don't you think you should? And I'd be like, well, and we'd sort of have a slightly awkward sort of conversation, because I, didn't always know these people very well and didn't necessarily want to get into all of that. And so often, the time together would end with them offering to pray. It's happened on numerous occasions. And in their prayer, they wouldn't like pray about the issue that we were meeting up to discuss. They'd pray that I would find a church. And I just started to find it really odd and incongruous that we were meeting up to deal with something that was threatening to, in a lot of cases, like ruin their marriage. And they'd come to me because either they or someone told them that I'd had an experience of recovery. And yet the focus became whether or not I was going to church. And it just really, I suppose it really got me thinking about what I'd inherited and what I'd grown up with, and why were people in that situation like speaking in that way? And why was that lady who I'd spent my life sort of, hanging on her words, why was she dismissing these two things that had brought me so much healing and brought me into recovery, and just kind of focusing down on whether I was attending a church on a Sunday? I guess that growing up, if I talk about my understanding of God and my life as a kid, I guess there are three things really that dominated everything, and this is the way I grew up understanding the world. The first thing is that I lost my sight in my teens and in my 20s. So when I was born, I was partially sighted. And there was no history of it in my family. And so they only discovered it when I stopped making progress with my reading at school, because the print in the books that I was reading gradually got smaller as they became more difficult. And so they realized something was wrong. We went to the hospital and we were told, I was about 5 or 6 at the time, we were told that I got scars on my retina, that it was a stable condition, that it would never get any worse, but it wouldn't get any better. And that was how I understood it. And the other thing that happened at the same time was that the doctor said that I'd never be able to drive, and I shouldn't ride a bike. But my dad was a keen cyclist, so he said that I would ride a bike and he would take responsibility for it. And so those two things were kind of massive messages that I carried with me. It would never improve, but it wouldn't get any worse. And that my dad said that it's okay to ride my bike, even though the doctor said I shouldn't. And so whenever I met anyone when I was at school explaining my condition to teachers for the next sort of 10 years, I'd always say things like, I'd explain how it affected me, and I'd say, it won't improve, but it'll never get any worse. And I'd often talk to people about how my dad says I can ride a bike, even though the doctor said I couldn't. And the strength of that was a positivity, was like a kind of, this isn't going to hold you back. You'll still be able to achieve. You'll still be able to do things. And obviously it won't get any worse. It was a very positive approach on the situation. But the weakness of that strength, if you like, was that there wasn't a lot of space to kind of dwell in any of the more difficult or challenging feelings around it. So when my eyesight deteriorated at the age of 15, very, very quickly, over the course of 2 days, I lost the sight in my right eye. And up until that point, my right eye had been the strongest of the two. And on a Saturday, I noticed there was something wrong. On the Sunday, I realized it was definitely wrong. on the Monday morning, we went to the hospital and told that, yes, that it had got worse and this was always a possibility, which was completely different to what we'd been told when it was first diagnosed, or misdiagnosed as it was. And I came home from the hospital and had lunch before going back to school at the age of 15. And my testimony for the next 20 years would be this, that I stood in my bedroom that lunchtime, and I didn't really know what to pray, but I sort of felt as though I was just standing before God, and I pressed play on my ghetto blaster in my bedroom, and listened to a U2 song called Ultraviolet Light. And I felt as though God spoke to me through the words of this song. And the words go, sometimes I feel like I don't know. Sometimes I feel like checking out. I want to get it right. Can't always be wrong. And love, it won't be long. And then this really kind of throbbing bass line comes in, and the percussion. And then the words say, oh, sugar, don't you cry. Oh, child, wipe the tear from your eyes. You know I need you to be strong. And the day's as dark as the night is long. I feel like trash. You make me feel clean. I'm in the black, can't see or be seen. Baby, 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 light my way. And I felt that in that moment, God was speaking to me and speaking positivity. And it was almost like through the feel of the song and through that moment, it was like a kind of palpable, aggressive positivity that I wasn't going to let this hold me down. And I was going to like push on and live and achieve and be successful. And I guess it was a doubling down of that idea that I'd taken from when it first got diagnosed. You know, you can ride your bike even though the doctor says you can't. In this situation, I've lost kind of virtually half of my sight, if not more, but I'm still going to push on, and God is with me and he's going to look after me. And I'd become a Christian. I'd grown up in a Methodist church, but my parents were involved in various other it was a kind of middle of the road Methodist church. There were some evangelical elements to it. But I used to go to a lot of other churches and youth groups and Christian events and things like that. And at the age of 9, I decided to make a decision to become a Christian. And from then on, following Jesus was the most important thing in my life. That's, I really believed that. And so my understanding of myself, my understanding of my eyesight, this positivity was all bound up in this relationship with God. There was a God who knew me and had a plan for my life and looked after me and wanted the best for me. And so I didn't have to worry about what was going to happen with my eyesight. I could put my faith in him and things would be okay and things would work out. And like I say, so that was when I was 15, right up until my mid-30s, that was my testimony. Even when it came to my eyesight deteriorating in my late 20s. So very, very gradually, I lost the rest of my sight throughout my 20s. So by the time I was 28, I couldn't see anything. I was completely blind. And even then, it was like, the worst has happened, but God is with me. And other people would always say, when I'd share this testimony, either formally or informally in small groups, people would always say, oh, it's so amazing that you're so full of faith. That's really inspirational. And I'd always talk about how, even though I'd never experienced physical healing, that God had healed me of any self-pity or doubt or fear or anything like that. And even though there were times when I'd feel down about my eyesight, I would wake up the next day and I'd feel like positive again, and I'd be able to get on. And I talk about everything that happened to my life as a kind of testimony of this. I talk about getting married to the girl of my dreams, adopting children, buying a house, whatever job I was doing at the time. I'd say, look, and God has used me in these ways. And so being a faithful Christian, even though I wasn't there was always this element of feeling as though I should be doing more. I wasn't seeing loads of people coming to faith, or I wasn't part of churches that grew significantly or anything like that. But my identity was all about having a personal relationship with God through Jesus, who helped me with all the challenges that I found in my life. But the other thing that was going on at the same time, and that was another kind of dominant issue in my life, and I'm not at all shy about talking about this, but I'll kind of mention it, and then if you want to ask more about it later on, you can do. Was this whole area of sex, and so the way I understood it was that I struggled with sex. That was the thing that held me back. The way I understood it was the thing that held me back in my relationship with God. I had from the age of 11, I'd struggled, when I could see, with like sometimes looking at pornography and masturbating, and then I discovered adult chat lines, and then in my 20s, I'd found it difficult not to call these adult chat and date lines, and I never wanted to meet anyone in person, but I used to have phone sex. And I always used to, through accountable relationships or through, I don't know, going forward for prayer after services or at big Christian events, always looking for release, always looking to be set free from it. I didn't think of it as an addiction. I just thought I struggled with sex. That was the thing that I struggled with. I used to talk to friends about like being, I don't know, like having a high sex drive maybe, or being highly sexed, and that was the thing. And I wanted to not do it, but I just couldn't not do it. I thought that when I got married, it would end, and there were periods when it did, but then I found myself phoning chat lines and sometimes having inappropriate text messages with people or emails. And as I mentioned earlier, eventually, I never admitted what I was doing. I never confessed anything. My wife would find out. I then, for short periods of my marriage, struggled with online gambling, and occasionally went for counseling about it, very begrudgingly, very reluctantly, and it wasn't very helpful. The people that I saw, it was all focused on the actual behavior rather than anything else. And even though it led to periods of time when I didn't act out, it would always come back again. And eventually, like over and over again, over the course of our marriage, my then wife found out about it. And it just got to this stage where she couldn't trust me anymore. And so in December 2015, she asked me to leave. She just couldn't go on. She'd forgiven me. We tried again, I think 6 times by then. And I'd always said and always intended to change, but I don't know, I just couldn't. And so after a very difficult 3 or 4 months where we'd taken very radical steps, and it was very unclear whether our marriage would continue, she asked me to leave the house and said that the relationship was over and that she would move towards a divorce. And at that point, I had to tell my parents, and I'd never told them any of this, even though my wife's parents had found out because she told them and I told them. But I'd kept it from my parents because I thought it would be the end of my relationship with them. I thought they'd like reject me. And so I told them. They were incredible. They were incredibly supportive. Through them and through my sister, I found this organization that specialized in this kind of addictive behavior. And I started the therapy that changed my life and that transformed everything. But the thing is that through that experience, I began to understand that everything I thought about myself, about my eyesight, about the issue around sex, and increasingly about my faith, I sort of got to the point where it felt as though everything I knew was wrong. So, for example, I'd spent 20 years sharing this testimony of how God's power and God's sovereignty had given me the positivity to deal with sight loss. But in the first session I had with my therapist, when we were just it was an introductory session for him to determine whether therapy with him was going to be the right thing. And he went through this massive long questionnaire. And it was one of those questionnaires where, I don't know if you've done them, where the majority of the questions you don't have to think about, because they just ask a load of questions about your health background and your personal circumstances. And a lot of them were yes or no. So he was bashing through like, tens of questions. And I was just going, yes, yes, no, no, yes. And then he said, have you experienced significant trauma in life? And I said, no. And there was this pause, this silence. And I thought he like lost his place in his list of questions or something. So there's a really long pause. And he said, oh, right. So you don't think you've experienced trauma? And I was like, no. Because I was thinking about like car crashes or my parents dying when I was a kid or something. And he said, don't you think that losing your eyesight is traumatic? And I said, no, not really. And that's honestly what I thought. That's honestly what I believed. And there was another really long pause. And he went, I think most people would describe that as a traumatic experience. And straight away, I guess it's years and years of conditioning to think in a particular way. And like I say, in some ways, it was a strength of my early days. I just started thinking, well, it might be a trauma for some people, but not for me, because my faith means that I've always had God with me and I've had an experience of unconditional love, and he's always been there for me. And I didn't really want to get into it. So I just kind of I just said, well, yeah, maybe, I don't know, possibly, but I don't think so. And then he left it and we carried on. But what I realized in the therapy that began, so the first month or so, there was a lot of emphasis on tools to stop acting out. So disrupting your brain patterns and changing the way you think and changing routines and becoming transparent and sharing everything with close friends and all this kind of stuff. There were these, it was very practical, and it was all about breaking the habit. But even from the beginning, but increasingly over that 18-month time scale of therapy, we began to delve into the depth of what might have led to me becoming what I understood now for the first time ever as addiction. And I was part of as part of my therapy, I went on a week-long residential that included a lot of group therapy. And during that time, it became apparent to me, although this is an ever evolving sort of thing. And I'm actually friends with, kind of unusually, I'm friends with that therapist now who's called Justin, who, if you listen to Nomad, he was on a few years ago talking about spiritual abuse. And I spent some time with him over this weekend, and we're talking a little bit about this whole thing. So, and some of what he said made me think again about whether my understanding is, needs to go on a level in terms of, my understanding of addiction and what led to it. But as one of the significant things that I began to understand was that my addictive behavior was a learnt behavior that anesthetized the pain and the grief and the anxiety and the lack of control and the despair and the self-loathing that was all associated with my eyesight. And that started in my adolescence. And because your brain is very plastic, and because of my faith, then it was very shameful. So it became a hidden, shameful activity that then became habitual and became addictive. And those feelings were buried so deeply inside of me that I didn't know they were there. And so during my recovery, when I would share with friends about these feelings, they'd be pretty shocked, because I'd spent 20 odd years talking about how God had healed me of being like of what I used to describe as self-pity. And yet I was discovering, and I had a couple of profound experiences where these feelings came out. And as I started to reflect about earlier times in my life, I realized that they were always there, and occasionally they'd come to the surface. And then there was all this other behavior, these kind of side effects that weren't to do with acting out, but were more and more evidence of these feelings being deeply, deeply repressed inside of me. So my like you say, I'd grown up as someone who'd gone blind, talking about positivity and my faith in God and all of this, and suddenly this was unraveling. And I'd grown up thinking about sex as something that was this area that I struggled with, but now I was understanding that it was this profound addiction that had like reshaped or misshapen my brain and was impacting on my personality. And there were all kinds of incredible experiences that I began to have during my recovery. I suppose most notable in that first 6 months or 12 months, where things like confidence, being able to concentrate, the way that I related to women, just very profound things that I've forgotten about now because they've just become part of who I am. But things about being confident around people. I used to think that I was in some ways a introvert, but I realized that my introvert kind of tendencies were to do with wanting to isolate myself because my brain was addicted to dopamine, and it was all about getting another dopamine hit, and that happened best when I was on my own doing things that I didn't want anyone else to know. And so as my understanding of my own identity to do with my eyesight and to do with sex, and even as I began to experience a kind of change in my character, then inevitably I started to have to sort of come to terms with my understanding of faith being different, because I just couldn't understand for a long time why God and the way that I understood God and my involvement in church and my praying and my times of worship, and I suppose some of the charismatic sort of experiences that I had, I was like, why hasn't God like sorted this out? Why hasn't God stepped in? Why didn't God tell me about this? And the reason why it jarred when I met with that lady and had coffee, and she said, running in therapy is okay, but you've got to find a church kid. And why it jarred when other people I was talking to about my recovery said, oh, but why don't you go to church? The reason that hit me so much is because a few years earlier, if I was sitting on their side of the coffee table, that's exactly what I would have said. But my experience now was that I'd found this healing that wasn't just recovery from addiction. It was like, oh my gosh, everything that I thought about myself is wrong. I wasn't really confident. I was absolutely like crippled by all this fear and anxiety. And I realized there was this particular experience I had where I realized that I really hated being blind, and I hated myself, and I hated the way that it made me, the way that I perceived the way I looked to other people, and a lot to do with control and stuff. And so I just had to start kind of questioning and trying to work out what I would still hold on to. And during that time, I used to say that I was nowhere. I just didn't know what I thought. And I would go through periods of going to church for a bit with friends, and then after going a couple of times, I'd just think, oh, this is just a waste of time. This isn't making any sense anymore. And then I'd not go to church, and people would ask me if I was going to church, and I'd be like, oh, well, not at the moment. I was really nervous about that. My mum I used to chat to my mum, and she would say, oh, when are you going to find a church again? And I didn't know if it was because I'd always been in leadership, and it was just that I was having to readjust to going to church and not being in leadership. But I guess that gradually, through gradually getting back involved in Nomads, through listening to people like Rob Bell, who's always been in this whole period has been very significant voice in my life, and other people as well. I guess I've very gradually come to a point of thinking, actually, this isn't a faith loss, as some people were concerned it was, but this is another step along the way. And I guess one of the ways that I described it was that it was kind of like falling out of the TV. It was kind of like that for up until this time in my life, it was like I was on a TV show and I just didn't realize. And then one day I fell out of the TV and looked back at what was on the screen and realized that it wasn't quite what I thought it was. And however tempting and comforting it sometimes seemed to climb back inside, I would never be able to shake the understanding that it was just a TV show and I'd fallen out of it. And so there's a guy called Carlton Pearson who I came across. I don't know if you come across him. There's a Netflix film about him, and he was a bishop in the AOG in America and went through a faith deconstruction. And I heard him interviewed once, and he said that he used to say in the early part of his deconstruction that he was nowhere in his faith. And then he said, as time went on, he moved the W, and he says, I say these days that I'm now here. And that just made so much sense. I guess my journey over the last 5 years is going from a place of feeling very nervous and embarrassed in certain circles to admit that I'm not going to church, to feel more confident that actually the community that I experience with friends and in much more informal ways is one that nourishes me. And whilst there are particular things that I miss about like attending church, I don't feel now as though that's like, I don't feel as though I have to apologize about not attending church. And anyway, I guess that comes down to what church is and how we understand church. I guess through various kind of conversations and reflections, I've begun to realize that far from a kind of losing of my faith, I describe what's happened as a broadening and an expanding of my faith. Although talking about my faith, I find that an interesting word. And I guess I'm just so aware that words have so much meaning and they're so loaded for certain people. But certainly my spirituality is much broader and much more expansive than it ever was. And that is a natural part of a faith journey. And I think that reading and hearing people like Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren talk about that kind of stuff, I guess I kind of moved from a place where I think, gosh, I lost the plot at some point, and am I ever going to find it again? To thinking, wow, maybe the faith that I grew up in had lost the plot a long time ago, and maybe I've just come to a place of understanding that. And honestly, it's only in the last year or so that I probably feel comfortable and confident enough to describe things in that way. I guess such was the importance and centrality of that inherited faith in my life that it feels very arrogant in a way to claim that. But I guess, and I'll kind of draw things to a close in a minute and let you ask some questions. But I guess a couple of things that really, I don't know, give me confidence about where I am now, I guess, and mean that I'm comfortable in talking about this, and even feel as though I might have something to share that's worth sharing in context like this. Is one is that I love to talk about this stuff. I love to reflect on it. I feel incredibly privileged to be part of Nomad and to have that opportunity in that sort of weird and wonderful context to talk and explore some of this kind of stuff. When we're not recording Nomad, like Tim and I chat about this stuff all the time, I read and I listen to other podcasts, and I talk about this with friends, and I do kind of different like spiritual practices, and probably there are certain things that I do, like sit in silence, which I like very much. It's a kind of very obvious part of my spirituality. But then there are other things that I do, like my running and I suppose other mindfulness practices. And I do all of these things and I'm consistent in doing them, and they bring me huge amounts of benefit in all kinds of different ways. And yet when I was an evangelical Christian, it was a constant battle around reading the Bible and praying about, I don't know, whatever it might be, evangelism or living in a holy way. And they were constant struggles, and the conversation was always, in the small groups that I existed in the accountable relationships that I had, it was always like, oh, I know I should be praying more, I know I should be reading my Bible more, I know I should be sharing my faith more. It's so hard, isn't it? Oh, let's pray that this week we really do that. And it was always a struggle. And yet now, and I remember this occasionally just strikes me. Now I just think, wow, I just listen to, like, there's no issue about, I really should listen to the latest such and such podcast because it will nourish me spiritually. I just do it because it's integral to who I am and I need it. And I suppose that gives me that sense of like this journey, however disconcerting it sometimes is, and however sometimes it feels a little bit like, and some conversations I have with people kind of, say this, like, will close friends who are still very much in that world will sort of express their concern about, where I am and the trajectory I'm on, and when are you going to find a church and all this kind of stuff. And yet this really reassures me. And I suppose the other part of that is my own experience of being present and experiencing peace. And both in terms of my addictive behavior and in terms of my faith experience growing up, everything was always about the next moment, or, then, when I, in a faith context, it'd always be like, when I consistently pray, or when I consistently start to fast and pray, or when I read the Bible, or when I share my faith, or when my friends become Christians, or when our church begins to grow, or when these young people that I'm a youth worker for, get baptized in the Holy Spirit, or when, and it was always the next moment. And even in my life, I realized now that so much of my time was spent looking forward to the next moment, the next holiday, the next evening that I had to myself, the next time we would be doing such and such a thing. And now it's all very much about the now, the present, and I'm sure a lot of that had to do with not being able to sit very easily in the present because there's all this suppressed pain that I didn't want to bring up. So that's really helpful as well. And the final thing that I would say, just before I definitely wrap up this bit of what I'm saying, is that there's so much wisdom in the things that I've kind of dug into and had the privilege of finding out about. So the therapy that I had, like, helped me to understand things to do with like neurology and addiction, and it helped me to understand things about myself. And a lot of the things that we explore on Nomad, or some of the things that I've read, and things like for example, in the early days of after my marriage broke down, the thing that kept me going spiritually was the Rob Bell's podcast. And what really hit me about it, as I used to listen to it very consistently, was how it seemed to help me every day, like every week. Like there were things that he was talking about that were very, very practical. And I began to contrast that with the faith that I'd grown up with, which literally was about, praying and reading the Bible. And it was almost like to the like do those things to the expense of everything else. And I've learned so much about myself and about all kinds of things in these last few years. And it makes me just think about the faith, the faith that I grew up in, where my experience of church, where I just think it was so void of wisdom. And there was so much emphasis, and it was so narrow on some very, very narrow practices that that it just lacked so much breadth and so much wisdom. And that's why I didn't find the healing that I needed to. And, things to do with sitting with pain and allowing yourself to feel suffering rather than trying to pray it away and move on to the next thing. And so, yeah, there's so much more I can say, but I hope that is like a helpful way of explaining how I've ended up where I am today, in this place where of continual kind of discovery. And like I say, just this weekend, there's some conversations that I've had that have made me think in an even slightly different way about recovery and what is at the heart of that. Yeah, that's the kind of strange, messy, like mixed up and complicated journey that has brought me to where I am today. And yeah, I feel very fortunate for the people and the things that have happened that have brought me to this place of, it's not like I'm not like full of, every day is not full of joy. Like there's difficulties and there's challenges and all of that's all part of it. And I realize that now, that it's the pain and the suffering and the difficulties and the challenges, it's all part of it. And I often say that my ambition now is to be as present as I can be. And in that I experience peace. So yeah, that's kind of where I am today.
That's awesome. Does anybody have any questions? I have a question.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I would just say that was an amazing story and a journey that you're on right now. And I think I would say accurately that that's a journey that's very similar to a lot of folks in our faith, in our congregation, in our group. How do you, the question I have is, how do you respond? Do you still have a lot of friends and family that kind of are where you were maybe 10 years ago or so, or, from a faith expression wise? And how do you interact with them today? And how do they interact with you? Are they still kind of like encouraging you to go to church? And, how do you interact with people who that fall into that category? And how does that make you feel, I guess, when you when maybe they're trying to, I would assume they're questioning where you're at and what you think, and how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I find depending on the situation, I find it hard, find it really difficult sometimes. So I do have some friends. I probably have less and less friends who are in that place, because I think that some of my friends who are in that place, it's just become like that we have less in common. And I think early on I had more conversations with them, and then it's become more difficult, because I think that one of the things that's really difficult, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately, because a very bizarre kind of coincidental connection has been made with someone that I know through my work, whose son lives in the UK, and then his son lives in Canada, and this guy in the UK is an evangelical, and his son lives an alternative lifestyle, snowboarding in Canada. And then his son shared with him a Nomad episode, and this guy sort of had a vague idea that I was involved with Nomad, but didn't really know much about it, and then was like, oh, I've just listened to a podcast with you, and we're going to meet up and talk. But one of the interesting things that he said, because he lives in a different part of the UK, one of the interesting things that he said, which kind of ties in with this, is that he said, I feel as though these days you can't. He said, I'd be really interested to talk to you about all this kind of stuff. He said, I find the deconstruction language quite difficult. It almost feels as though these days, if you disagree with someone, you can't be friends with them. And I found that really interesting that he's saying that, because my experience is that it's quite difficult. I find it quite difficult to chat to some of my friends who are still very evangelical, because I'm full of questions these days, but they're still full of statements. And so I'm very happy to have a conversation and explore ideas, but where the tension happens, and I'm sure you find this, is that I've got questions, but they've got these statements, these red lines that you can't cross. And so when you question that, then they're like, but you can't question that. Like, how are you questioning that? I can think of one friend in particular who was my best friend when I was at university and probably throughout my 20s. And he's now kind of in church leadership, and he's an academic, and he writes and he tours around the world talking about charismatic Christianity. And I guess we've gradually stopped talking about it, because for a time we would swap like podcasts that we were listening to and we would talk, but conversation would just get stuck, because he would say things like, you just can't, like, how can you say that? And I suppose it's because if you don't share the same understanding of like, for example, the Bible, he would say to me, but if you're saying that, then you're disagreeing with the Bible. And I'd say, well, maybe, or maybe it's just a different interpretation. But then he would say, but that's your interpretation. Or sometimes people throw at me the idea that you've begun to interpret things in a very convenient way that makes it easy. So you're saying that they would say, oh, okay, so you found this quote faith where you don't have to go to church, you don't have to follow the same moral guidelines, you don't pray like you used to, you don't read the Bible. Oh, that's all quite convenient, isn't it? What's left? You've just come up with something that you've kind of molded something to fit your situation. So I find it difficult. I was with my parents this afternoon, and my mum is still very committed evangelical Christian. And occasionally, so again, we just don't talk about it so much, but occasionally she'll say things. So it really caught me off guard. She's just started going to like an informal, I suppose you'd call it, like, people in the UK don't talk so much about fresh expressions anymore, but like 10 years ago, it was like a really big deal. It was going to be the thing that saved the church. And she's just started going to this sort of fresh expressions thing. And she said, oh, it's a shame that your train's at 5 o'clock, because if you were staying, we could have gone to the gathering, which is this fresh expression. And I just, without thinking, I just said, I wouldn't, well, even if my train was late, I wouldn't go to that. And then she was quite upset. She's like, why not? And I said, oh, I just wouldn't. And she said, oh, what have you got against church? What is it that you've got against church? And I said, oh, I haven't got anything against church. I just don't go. And then and the conversation just ended. I suppose on my better days, and when I'm trying, like, what I would really like to do is just ask good questions and share my own experience. I guess that's all I can do. But it is difficult. I suppose the final thing that I'd say is I just try and be really sensitive as well, because I don't want to come across arrogant. I don't want to come across like I've got all the answers. In some ways, you see, my marriage ending, like, it was the worst thing that's ever happened. Honestly, it was. I'm very privileged. I'm very fortunate now that I have a really good relationship with my ex-wife and with her fiance, and so for our kids and all that, it's really, really good. One of the kind of things about being single for 6 years is that I've been able to go through all of this sort of on my own. Whereas I've got friends who are in relationships so I was speaking to a friend on Friday night whose wife is fully evangelical, and he's sort of deconstructing a little bit, and he's not quite where I am. But I'm just aware in those situations, just like that, you just got to be really sensitive, because we're all at different stages, and like, people have to learn things on their own or get to points on their own, and like, we all learn things at different times, and that's fine. And there are extra complications for some people that I don't experience. So I suppose trying to be honest trying to be sensitive, trying to ask good questions, and but like I say, a lot of those conversations don't happen anymore, because I think those conversations didn't go anywhere, and so the nature of my friendship with some of those people changed.
Nick, I listened to you and Tim have a conversation about how the whole thing about being how separated from God your church experiences used to make you feel, and that just thinking we are separated from God was such a big point of a lot of evangelical churches, and all the practices you did, from communion to prayer to how you read the Bible, all kind of kept reminding you of how separated you are from God, and that trying to tell you need to deal with that. And I'm just wondering, as you've moved more in the direction of seeing God as in all of us, how that has changed. I mean, maybe that makes it harder to go through a regular church service. Or definitely. Yeah, I think that's such a kind of, it's so powerful. So one of the things definitely that I really like, I really like music, and I used to play the drums, and so I used to be involved in like worship and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I really missed when I stopped going to church was singing and that whole kind of music and stuff. I'm one of the church that I went to, like, for the longest, I went to for, I don't know, 2 or 3 months. And I used to like it because it was quite chilled and it was quite trendy, and the coffee was really good and people were very friendly. But and the music was good. But one thing that really struck me about it and was a kind of eye opener, that it was one of these things I thought, oh yeah, this was always the case, but now this just seems crazy, was the kind of mental gymnastics that was going on, that the worship leader would lead everyone in. And so I remember particularly one Sunday, she said, we'd be halfway through a sort of half-hour, time of sung worship. And she said, I don't know about you, but I'm finding it really hard to press into God this morning. It's just like this, just something blocking it. I'm just really praying that as we continue to worship God, we might like feel him close to us. I can't remember, but she went on, and it was almost like all the way through the worship, it was this, like, she was in this kind of mental battle to reach God. And it really hit me on that occasion. I just thought, oh yeah, this is exactly what it was. Like, I really enjoyed singing and being part of a kind of congregation singing, and that whole kind of sense of something spiritual and supernatural happening. But I realized that much of the time that I spent in those contexts was like a mental battle to kind of repent of all the things that I'd done wrong, try and deal with the guilt that I was carrying with me, all the kind of negativity and everything, and get to a place where somehow you could be free of it all and experience something of God's presence. And I remember that particular morning just constantly thinking, every time this worship leader would say something along those lines, I would just be thinking, no, he's already here. It's here. It's all happening. He's already here. And I suppose that has become like a really significant part of my experience, so that when I sit in silence, or even if I'm just walking my kids to school, or if I'm running, or just sink into that place of like awareness and noticing things and becoming aware of my thoughts or just my breathing, there isn't this kind of litany of things that I've got to work through. It's like, oh, and here we are, here I am, and here God is, or the divine, or however we define that, here it is. And so yeah, it is that is definitely one of the reasons. The thought of going to that thing with my mum today was I don't know, maybe I should just go and see what it's like sometime. But the thing that would put me off would be all of that stuff, which I just think is unhelpful. And yeah, I don't know, damaging, make it sound too strong, but it's just not where I am now. So it would feel at best unnecessary, and at worst you're in a place where people are putting up loads of barriers between you and experiencing the divine, and that would feel uncomfortable. And in the end, that's why I stopped going to church, and I haven't gone back, because I came away feeling more annoyed and frustrated than I did before I went, and it just wasn't worth it. Has that answered the question? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. So a lot of the podcasts that you guys talk about has to do with being in the church with your group of friends and more informal and those kinds of things. Do you still feel like you have that church experience within your small community of friends and more informal that you've had when you maybe first started Nomad, and you talked about that? Has that grown and continued throughout the 12 or 13 years you guys have been doing this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm not really part of a faith. I'm not really part of a faith community in the sense that I'm part of a group that meets together regularly. But I would say that in the engagement that I have through me, so say Nomad, for example, and through my friendship with Tim, like we hang out once a week, usually for drink or food. I record with him at least once a month. And then we have a hosts WhatsApp group, and we regularly send each other messages or voice notes, and we sometimes kind of sort of chat things through on there. So that's all there is. There isn't like that. We sometimes meet with other Nomad listeners, but they're kind of a bit sporadic, and they're good. But through all of that, there is an extension. So it's not like I just turn up and record something and then, we continue the conversation. And then I've got quite a few friends who, for various reasons, they're people I've reconnected with, or I've got to know over the last couple of years, or whatever it might be, who also listen to Nomads. And like, probably not, some of them don't listen to every episode, but then particularly when there's something that resonates with people, they'll really, I'll have conversations with them. And so there are friends who I either have kind of semi-regular phone calls with, or would go out for a drink with semi-regularly. I think if I'm really honest, I think that I find that those are kind of very nourishing and very like helpful conversations, very strengthening, and they give me the kind of encouragement and I don't know how you describe it, the sort of input that church was always supposed to give me growing up, I think. But I think the only thing that I find frustrating about it is that they're kind of one-to-one, they're often one-to-one conversations, or they are I'm meeting up with people. So like today, so yesterday and last night and this morning, I went to visit Justin, who was my therapist, who's now engaged to someone who, and they're both in this kind of deconstruction journey. They both, especially his fiance, is like a big Nomad listener, and just hanging out with them was amazing. It was really great, and they were saying how good it was to be able to talk about this kind of stuff and connect on it, and for them to have someone who really understands their journey. But I sort of think it's a shame that they live so far away from me, and it's a shame that I seem to have a series of these conversations throughout the month. And I sometimes think I'll be like, in the olden days, you just go to church and you'd all be there together. And I sometimes think it would be cool if you could kind of get something going where you were meeting regularly to talk about this kind of stuff. And I do sometimes wonder about that. And it's something that Tim and I sometimes talk about, but then there's all kinds of other bits of baggage that like you bring over, that I bring over from being a youth worker or leading small groups in churches. And I don't know. So I wonder if in the future that's something I quite like to explore. But definitely those conversations and the relationships that I'm in, that kind of network, the podcasts that I listen to, I definitely, I like I say, it's one of those things that I've kind of grown into and become more confident of saying. I definitely feel and know that I do grow and develop through those conversations, through listening to those things, through being involved in Nomad. I grow through all of that in the kind of way that church was always supposed to, be something that would develop your spirituality.
I'd love to know what your definition of church is in your own mind.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. It's probably like, what is my definition of church? Yeah, I don't know really. I suppose when I think about church, I think about people getting together to encourage one another in their faith journey. Like, as I give this answer, I think I in my head, I'm thinking, you should be talking about what is it like ecclesio and all of that kind of stuff, and talk about Greek and the marketplace and all of that. But if I'm being really honest, I suppose when I think about church, I'm thinking about getting together with other people and meeting with them and meeting with God. And so, because my understanding of like what it is to connect with people, and because my understanding of God has changed so much, I suppose by definition, my understanding of church has changed so much. And that's why having a conversation like over a coffee can be a really, for me, it can be a really significant experience of connecting with someone and connecting with the divine. I don't know, I'm always a bit uncomfortable about saying whether that's church though, because my days of exploring, like when Fresh Expressions was the thing in the UK, you would constantly go to gatherings where people would talk about how they'd started a new church, and it turned out to be them and one other person going for a coffee. And I'd always think, that doesn't really sound like church to me. But now I'm saying that. But I think also I was chatting to my friend Michael. So Michael was the other guy who was involved in Nomad right in the beginning, and I was still really good friends with him. And we were having lunch on Friday and just talking about how now I would be much more, we're both really into football, and we were talking about whether going to a football match, like English football, soccer, whether that is a genuine experience of like, whether there's something divine about being with 25,000 people in a stadium singing and cheering, that whether there's something connecting with those other people, and whether it's okay to say that that's a kind of experience akin to church, and whether you say, oh no, it's not, it's just a kind of, it's like a sort of imitation of it. And I think these days I'm a lot more comfortable in associating spiritual experiences with things that I wouldn't have done previously, like a sporting event, like running. So I did it. Oh yeah, that's why we had this conversation, because on Monday I did a marathon in Boston, like the original Boston in the UK, which is very different to Boston in America. But it was just a brilliant experience. It was like it was one of the most uplifting like experiences I've had for ages. And I finished it, and like a really good friend of mine who actually he's actually a conservative evangelical Christian. We just never talk about Christianity anymore. Although it turns out his wife is a Nomad listener. So it's all very interesting. Anyway, we just had this brilliant experience. We stayed the night, we got up in the morning, we ran the race, we chatted to people as we ran. There was like over 1,000 people there having a great time, like achieving what they wanted to. There was just such an uplifting atmosphere. We drove home and drank great coffee and ate loads of cake and listened to music. And it was I just thought, I should do this more often. And I felt so like, I don't know, just like buzzing. And I suppose it's endorphins as well. And that's how I started this conversation with Michael, because I was like, well, that's like, what is that if that's not a spiritual experience? And so my answer to your question is, I don't know really, but all of these other things make me think that church, perhaps I think of church as being a lot broader than I used to.
Thank you.
Nick, I'd be curious to hear how you talk to your kids about God and if that feels daunting or maybe your previous experience or your experience growing up informs how you behave around. I don't know if it feels touchy or you feel, well, just, tell us about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. So it's very interesting in that we adopted our children when they were 3 and 1. And I think in hindsight, adopting them, I started my issues around online gambling started just after we adopted them, which can't be a coincidence, I think, in hindsight. And so there was like a year, 18 months when we were together as a family before we split up. So they are old enough to kind of, they were old enough. My daughter was 5 or 6 when I split up, and my son was like 4. And so we went through the whole thing and my daughter's very I don't know, she's quite emotionally mature in a way, and she asks loads of questions. And so even in those days, she'd be asking all kinds of stuff about, I don't know, she'd be like, why isn't mummy forgiving you? Jesus says we should forgive people. Will she forgive you one day? All of this kind of stuff. And we, at that time, we were part of like a Pentecostal church. And so they were part of that. And then interestingly, when we separated, I went on this journey, and Laura, who's my ex-wife, she got even more involved in the church that I'd been part of. She was still part of, and she'd always been involved, but it went even more extreme, and she started doing some preaching and leading worship and leading some discipleship groups and all this kind of stuff. And at that point, it was kind of like a little bit tricky, because they were like, my kids were like, oh, why don't you go to church anymore? And then I did start going to that church that I mentioned, where, the worship and the coffee and the welcome was pretty good. And then we agreed that they would come to that church with me one Sunday and go to Laura's church with her another Sunday. And there was lots going on, and they would talk a lot about God and be very, we'd have these very big conversations about it. But then a few things happened at the church that Laura was part of, and a lot to do with kind of limits on women's leadership and stuff like that. And then she went on a very, very quick deconstruction journey and has sort of concluded that she doesn't believe anything. And she thinks that, and we go, we're friends, so we kind of chat about this, and she doesn't say this in like a nasty way or anything, but she thinks that Nomad's way too Christian. She thinks it's like far too prescriptive and faith-based. So now the context is that my kids think that are a bit confused as to why I'm still a Christian. they're like, why do you still believe in, like my daughter said, why do you believe in God? And so I've gone through lots of stages of finding it worrying that I should be providing them with a faith basis, and then like being concerned about just thinking like, what am I saying and what messages are they getting and all of that kind of stuff. And to be honest, where I am now is I've just kind of landed in this place where I just think I don't really worry about it at all. And I want them to be free thinkers, and I want to encourage them to think, and I want to encourage them to ask questions. And often when we chat about things, my son sort of like he'll sometimes he'll say he believes in God and sometimes he won't. But I think he's still at the age where, because I say that I do believe in, like I believe that Jesus existed and I do believe in God, then I think he sort of goes along with that, and he says that he does because I think he wants to be like me sometimes still. Whereas my daughter will be a lot more dismissive of it. And I'll just kind of ask questions about things that she says sometimes, because she'll say, oh, I think that's stupid. And I'll say, well, why do you think that's stupid? Because da 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 da. And there are some like old habits die hard. So I find it really, I still like make us pray before we eat, which they both find quite frustrating. But what I say about that is that I say, like, I don't mind if you believe in God, that's great. And if you don't, it's fine, it's great. There's no problem. But like, let's be grateful. Like, it's really important that we're grateful. And we haven't grown this food, and we haven't like got it here. We just bought it from the shop, and like, let's be grateful. And at night, I still say prayer with my son, but my daughter has told me she wants me to stop saying a prayer. So that's cool, that's fine. So I just don't. So I kind of like, and I talk to them about things, and occasionally, so there was a Nomad episode we did recently about, I don't know if you might have heard it, about near-death experiences. And my kids are just obsessed with death. Like, they just will talk about it endlessly, like anything. I dread something coming on the news about someone famous dying, or because that'll be the conversation like for the day. So, but I played them a little bit of that interview and talked to them about it. And they were really interested and like really sort of fascinated by it. And so I suppose I've got to the stage now where I'm not reading the Bible with them. I pray with my son, make sure we pray before we eat. But yeah, apart from that, I guess it's just my own. I'll talk about things as spiritual experiences, and I'll talk about silence, but I'm also trying not to kind of push it too much. And there are some times where I feel as though they are further along in terms of, I did go through a period of making them sit in silence for 4 minutes when we got home from school a few years ago. And I thought it would be this, like, I just had this delusional idea that, I'd teach them to meditate, at a very young age, and it'd be really good. But then it just struck me, like, after forcing them to do it, and they just couldn't do it without laughing or, like moaning about it. It just struck me that they would sit in silence and draw or play Lego for like, I don't know, 45 minutes or an hour on their own. And I just noticed it one day and just thought, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm trying to get them to sit quietly and be mindful for 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And yet they just do it naturally when they're playing on their own. And I should probably learn from them rather than the other way around. So yeah, that's where it is at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. You go.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. Unfortunately, we missed part of the presentation. We're coming from dinner and flying over the snowstorm, a line of traffic. So I missed, what therapy or therapies did you take on stage?
Oh, sure.
can't hear you very well. Did you say what therapy? What therapy did I?
Therapy or therapies did you take on during that stage after divorce?
Sure. So so there's an organization in the UK called Paul, I think they just called Paula Hall Associates. So Paula Hall is a therapist who specializes in sexual behavior addiction, and she's written a couple of books on the topic, and there are a number of kind of therapists within her team. And I went to see, I initially started to see a therapist who was part of that setup, because it was, I don't know, I think they still sort of, so at the time they sort of advertised themselves as a Christian. They offered a Christian sort of stream as well as a secular stream, particularly when it came to their residentials. I think I'm right in saying that they don't do the Christian one anymore, because they felt there was much more benefit in people of all kinds of different backgrounds coming together and doing the residential stuff. But it was based on I don't know if it's based on an actual theory of something, but it had at its core, so Justin, who's the therapist who I saw, I remember in the first session that I had, he said that he wanted me to talk about, when we met together and when I talked about what I was going through, he wanted me to talk about it as to articulate it along the lines of that I was struggling with sexual behavior addiction, rather than saying like I'm an addict. So it's a little bit different than 12 steps. So I've got friends. So one of my best friend's sister went through 12 steps as an alcoholic, and it's changed her life. So I've got no issue. And I've read like Russell Brand's book on 12 steps, and it's brilliant. If it works, it's amazing. But it's slightly different in that this approach sees this behavior as this addiction as something that you can recover from. So you don't say, so he said to me, like, we believe that people can make a full recovery from this, and that this addictive behavior that they struggle with doesn't necessarily have to be what kind of defines them for the rest of their lives. So we don't say, hi, I'm Nick, I'm an addict. We say I'm struggling with addictive behavior. And so so the elements of it included kind of various tools so there's this thing called I'm going to forget about it now because it's so long ago. It was the acronym was RUN. So it was I can't even remember any of what the letters stand for. That's really bad. But it was things like, so early on, there were techniques, there were kind of multisensory techniques to disrupt the way your brain was thinking. So for example, I moved furniture around at home. I sat in a different desk at work. If I felt triggered, I would leave the room and go and do something differently. They recommended using smelling salts. They recommended having something to look at that would kind of bring you back or disrupt your thinking. Or in my case, I had a recording of my kids. So if I felt triggered to act out, I would play this recording. But they also recommended changing all of those stimuli regularly so that you didn't become used to it. It was all about disrupting the patterns in your brain and disrupting these neural pathways that were very set. And he recommended a book called Your Brain on Porn, which is a very short book. It's only a couple of dollars online. You can get an ebook, and that was one of the most important books I ever read. And that was it's kind of a mixture of kind of a neuroscientist wrote it, I think, or his wife was, and it was all around the phenomenon. I mean, it's quite a few years old now, but it was investigating the phenomenon of people deciding to stop looking at pornography on the internet, and all these message boards popped up all over the world of people doing what they described as a reboot. And it was exploring the neurology of what happened when you stopped looking at pornography over a period of time. And the idea being that your brain, because you become addicted to the dopamine, your brain literally reshapes. And these people would start posting on these message boards, and they weren't Christian, they weren't like religious groups, they were just people who decided to stop doing it. And then they would start posting things about how their mental health was improving, how they weren't feeling depressed anymore, or how their confidence with, I mean, in this book, it's because it's not Christian, so it's kind of quite, it was quite, I don't know, just a bit surprising reading it, because these guys are writing about how their confidence with women has like gone up massively because they're not looking at porn anymore, and just about their kind of brain fog and things drifting away. So there was that part of it, but then the really deep stuff was that it wasn't like, although he mentioned things like like CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, what was different from any other therapy that I had previously in any other counseling, whether it was in a Christian or secular context, was that it delved deeply into who I was and into the kind of feelings that lay beneath all of that, feelings to do with my anxiety and fear and lack of control around my eyesight. And I think that was, for me, the really profound difference that I found in this therapy against any other that I'd gone through, that it really, it felt like, it just felt like it. And in hindsight, I would think, gosh, I've had conversations that have almost kind of got to this point at other times, but we've never quite gone this deep. And I think that was the real, I think it was one of the game changers for me. Plus that I was just in the most desperate place I'd ever been. And I don't know if I'd have had that sort of therapy earlier on in my life, if it had have had such a big impact. But for me, when my marriage ended, it was sort of like my life was over. And I just didn't, it was like I was absolutely desperate. And so I bought into that therapy, as much as I've bought into anything else in my life. And so reading that book, and also because it resonated with experiences that I was having at the time, and I started to find my confidence grew, and that, yeah, all these different things were happening. But yeah, so if you Google Paula Hall, or if you Google the book Your Brain on Porn, then it's in that sort of, like I say, I don't know if there's a psychological term to kind of describe it, but that's what I had.
Well, I kind of want to get things wrapped up. Kind of, it's getting a little late. I suppose it's really late for you.
Time to get up, see.
But I did have one kind of final question, I guess, and then maybe two questions real quick. Maybe they'll kind of roll together. But how do you define? Do you still define yourself as a Christian, and what does that, and what attributes of that, of being a Christian, do you subscribe to? And then I guess the final question I would have is, what's next? What's next for Nick?
Oh yeah, great. They're great. The questions are so good. Thank you so much. It's just great to be with you tonight and to talk about some of this. I did something like this in the autumn and got asked a lot of bizarre questions and started to wonder whether anyone had ever listened to Nomad. It was very odd. So it's great to be asked such brilliant questions. So what defines me as a Christian? Yeah, I don't know. That's a very good question. And I think that I would probably say, because I believe that Jesus existed and that I grew up in the Christian tradition, and so it makes sense there's a lot of stuff to do with that I hold on to. So although I've read, a
kind of read different things of different, you know, people of different traditions a little bit, not loads, but just stuff like Ram Dass, and I don't know, there's a few people who've been on Nomad who've talked about, like, Tim's done a bit of like an exploration into paganism in the UK, but I've never like come across anything where I've thought, oh yeah, that's what I am. Like, I was chatting to someone the other day and they said, oh, I now describe myself as a spiritual humanist. And I was just like, I don't know what I describe myself as. So I think I would describe myself as a Christian because I still believe in Jesus. I grew up in that tradition, so that's just what I've grown up in. And there are still things that I think are compelling about Jesus, but then there's loads of kind of breadth to that. And so whether someone else would, you know, some of my friends who are more still in the evangelical world would say that's enough to constitute being a Christian. I don't know. And if they said, oh, actually, you're not a Christian, then I'd be like, oh, okay. Like, I don't know. I'm just not sure. And I don't know what. I suppose what I wonder is, and this comes back, there's loads of questions about everything that I have, really. I wonder whether there's part of me that thinks if someone said, well, you're not really a Christian because you don't like trying to share, you don't evangelize and you don't bring other people to faith in Jesus, so how can you call yourself a Christian? And surely that's what Jesus was, you know, sent the disciples out to do. But there's so much in my life now that I experience, and I think that I'm experiencing some of the things that my former faith was supposed to, or that they would have hoped that I would experience, and now I am. So surely the fruit is, you know, the end result is kind of important. I don't know. I'm sort of confusing myself now by what I'm saying. So I don't know. Something to do with that anyway. Something to do with what I grew up in and still, believing in Jesus. And in terms of what's next, I don't know. That's the exciting part, isn't it? I suppose. Like I just got lots of questions. So for example, today, so chatting with Justin, the way I've understood it is that my recovery was dealing with the issues around my eyesight, and it was all this anxiety, anxiety, fear, shame, all of that kind of stuff. And one thing I'm exploring, don't tell anyone this, because it might not happen. But one thing I'm exploring is writing. It's like writing a book about like this whole journey and this whole kind of faith experience thing. And a few people have said, oh, you should write a book. Like, I don't know whether they were joking. And then I've sort of given it a go and I've written a couple of chapters and I've really enjoyed it. It's really helped me to process some things. And so whether or not it comes to anything, but because I'd written a chapter about my eyesight and a bit about what I've shared tonight around my understanding of it, I wanted to see what Justin thought. I didn't tell him that I was writing, but I just said, oh, I've been thinking about this sort of stuff. And he said today, oh, connection. It all comes down to connection, and addiction comes from attachment issues. And so recovery is fundamentally about connection. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because for the last 5 or 6 years, I thought it was all about coming to terms with my eyesight issues. So I think what's next is like, who knows? And that's the really exciting thing. Like, I have no idea what's around the corner. But I think that all these questions mean that there's just a never ending, and this is why I sort of really enjoy having these conversations and doing Nomad, because there are just so many questions to explore and to work out. And so this might open up a whole new understanding for me of what has really been at the heart of my recovery, or is there something else that I didn't realize has been really central to it? And I just find that so helpful. And as I say that, it sounds all a bit like, I don't know whether it sounds a bit, oh gosh, you're just going to think about things and, pontificate more. But what it does, what I find, my experience of this whole thing is that it just brings more life to me, and that deeper understanding and better knowing things. And it means then that there's even more kind of peace, and I'm even more patient with my kids, apart from really early in the morning when they're being really rude and spilling breakfast cereal all over the floor. But it feels exciting. And I suppose the expansiveness of it all is that is from the questions. And rather than being part of a faith expression that is full of statements, and you've kind of learnt the statements and you're just trying to implement them better in your life unsuccessfully, I suppose the spirituality that I'm experiencing now is one of just, there's so many questions, there's so many things to explore, there's so many things to think about, there's so many people to meet, and there's so much to learn. And that makes it a very interesting, compelling and exciting journey.
Great. Any other final thoughts from anyone, or any comments? Or Nick, thanks so much for spending time with us and sharing your story. It was great, and just really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And maybe we'll do it again sometime. And if you're ever in Colorado, stop on by. So
yeah, I would love to. Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and being able to share with you. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.